Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to today's newspaper review. Let's look at the stories dominating today's newspaper headline. But firstly, we'll start from the Punch newspaper. On the Punch newspaper in page 2, post-primary chaos worsens as INEC faces candidate submission deadline. To read more on that story, go to page 2 of the Punch newspaper. At the top of the Punch newspaper, Nigeria's foreign debt to hit $72.6 billion after 2027 polls, says IMF. This is coming from the International Monetary Fund, saying that Nigeria's foreign debt has hit up to $72.6 after 2027 polls. To read more on that story, go to page 9 of the Punch newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Elumelu appointed chairman of Seplat Energy. Congratulations to Tony Elumelu as he was appointed as chairman of Seplat Energy. To read more on that story, you go to page 9 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, renewed hope for Federal Capital Territory. President Tinubu commissions arterial road number 5, Obafemi Awolowo Way, from Life Camp Junction to RRIII. Today, our president will be commissioning arterial road number 5, Obafemi Awolowo Way. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent. On the Daily Independent, it is boldly written there, despite inflation, security woes, Nigeria is progressing, says FG. This is coming from the federal government, saying that despite the inflation, the high inflation and security crisis, Nigeria is still progressing. How true is this? At the top of the newspaper, Senate calls for ban on imported fabrics. The Senate has called for ban on imported fabrics. To read more on that story, you go to page 4 of the Daily Independent newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Nigerians reforms growing economy, but poverty still pivots, says IMF. To read more on that story, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Tony Elumelu appointed chairman of Seplat Energy. Congratulations to Tony Elumelu as he was appointed as chairman of Seplat Energy. To read more on that story, you go to page 7 of the Daily Independent newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Matrix, boldly written, Democracy Day, FG defends Tinubu's reforms, says Nigeria on path to recovery. At the top of the newspaper, on page 3, Tony Elumelu images Seplat Energy chairman, Okon, named CEO. Congratulations to Tony Elumelu as he imaged as Seplat Energy chairman. To read more on that story, go to page 3 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, 2027 polls timetable saga. Why INEC is challenging court rulings, says Amopitan. To read more on that story, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, EFCC arraigns Blessing CEO for fresh alleged 69.1 million naira fraud. Still on sports, Real Madrid, 130 million euros. Julian Alvarez bid laughed off by Atletico. To read more on that story on sports, you go to page 25 of the Matrix newspaper. Away from that newspaper to The Guardian. On The Guardian, in page 6, household ration swapped to charcoal as cooking gas records 67% spike. The rate at which our cooking gas now has skyrocketed. 1 kg of gas now is cost about 2,000 naira. So households are switching back to using the charcoal in making their dish. To read more on that story, you go to page 6 of The Guardian newspaper. At the top of The Guardian newspaper, IMF backs Nigerians' reform progress, warns poverty, food, insecurity may worsen. The International Monetary Fund has backed Nigerian reform progress, and they are warning against the high cost of food, insecurity, and the poverty as is worsening day by day. To read more on that story, you go to page 16 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Senate to consider single term for presidents, governors after 2027 polls. The Senate to consider single term for presidents, governors after 2027 polls. To read more on that story, go to page 3 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Times. On the Daily Times, it is boldly written, 2027, Falani raises red flag, list insecurity, attacks on fresh speech, hunger as threat to democracy, says it may undermine credibility of general elections. At the top of the newspaper, Ebola, Tinubu approves 10 billion naira for emergency preparedness, establishes task force. This is on Ebola. President Tinubu has approved 10 billion for emergency preparedness to prepare against the Ebola crisis. Still in the same newspaper, FG defends reforms as IMF forecast 4% growth despite poverty concern. Federal government defends reforms as international monetary funds forecast 4% growth despite the poverty concerns. Away from that newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune. On the Nigerian Tribune, still on renewed hope of Federal Capital Territory, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu commissions arterial road, number 5 Obafemi Awolowo Way, from Life Camp Junction to RRIII. At the top of the newspaper, under my watch, 1,859 families have accessed 128 billion naira for housing, says Tinubu. President Tinubu says under his watch that 1,859 families have accessed 128 billion naira for just housing. To read more on that story, you go to page 2 of the Nigerian Tribune. Still in the same newspaper, INEC fully recognizes Wike-backed PDP, NWC. INEC fully recognizes Wike-backed PDP, NWC. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. On the Daily Monitor, Democracy Day, FG working to solve Nigeria's challenges, says Tinubu. Democracy Day, which is June 12th, the federal government are working to solve Nigeria's challenges. This is coming from President Tinubu saying that the federal government are working to solve Nigeria's challenges. What are the Nigerian challenges? Insecurity, hunger, and rest of all. At the top of the newspaper, reps to Tinubu, flush out bandits, kidnappers from Nigeria. This is coming from the House of Representatives to President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, telling him to flush out bandits, kidnappers from Nigeria. How is he going to flush them out? To read more on that story, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, IMF hails Nigerian struck economic reforms, resilience. Away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph in page 2, 3, 6, and 29 on insecurity, reps summoned service chiefs, Ribadu, Oyedele, and others. The House of Representatives have summoned the service chiefs, who are Ribadu, Oyedele, and other service chiefs. To read more on that story, go to page 2, 3, 6, and 29 of the New Telegraph. At the top of the New Telegraph, Labour proposes July date for fresh minimum wage negotiations. The Labour has proposed July date for fresh minimum wage negotiations. To read more on that story, go to page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Tinubu creates task force on Ebola, okays 10 billion naira for emergency preparedness. To read more on that story, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. Lastly, on page 4 of the New Telegraph, June 12, Nigeria moving in right direction, says FG. This is coming from the federal government on June 12. June 12 is the Democracy Day. The Nigerians, they are saying that Nigerians is moving in a right direction. How true is this statement that Nigeria is moving in the right direction? To read more on that story, you go to page 4 of the New Telegraph. And that's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Esum. Do have a beautiful day.